It all started with a post on the Let's Not Meet subreddit in 2012. The post read, "About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite. But all of that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park, quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking, headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky, and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still, until I could make out his face. His eyes were open wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back, and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put about a half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and the sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved, until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time staring at him, and then he started moving toward me again. He took giant, exaggerated tiptoed steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone. Except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point I ran away or pulled out my pepper spray or my cell phone or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen as the smiling man crept toward me. And then he stopped again, about a car length away from me. Still smiling his smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to my mind. What I meant was, "What do you want?" In an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper of, "What the?" Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around, very slowly, and started dance walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back on him again, I just watched him go until I was far enough away to almost be out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in terror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side road and back onto the better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk, he didn't look high, he looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see. This story is widely regarded as one of the best creepypastas of all time. This is the story of the Smiling Man. It's one you've probably heard before. It was spread around quite a bit during the peak of creepypasta fever. There's a point in time when the majority of the internet seemed to like these internet horror stories. They were being spread to just about every nook and cranny that the internet had to offer. 2012 was the peak of this love for creepypastas, before it would start its gradual decline a few years later. The Smiling Man was posted to the internet not with the intent of becoming a creepypasta though. But at this time, any horror-related story posted to the internet was considered a creepypasta. Creepypasta had become an umbrella term of sorts for all of these stories, sightings, and creepy happenings being posted. As I mentioned before, the story was first posted to the Let's Not Meet subreddit on April 6, 2012. This subreddit focuses on real stories of people meeting strangers that they never want to meet again. The subreddit's own bio reads, "A place to read spine-tingling, unusual, terrifyingly true stories about people you never want to meet again." The keyword that I pulled out of this bio is true. So this encounter is believed to be true, and Blue Title, the OP of this original story, declared this story to be true. This is one of the core aspects of early creepypastas. They all carried a small fragment of legitimacy to them. After all, nothing is more scary than reality. Not every story that would go down as a classic in the community followed this rule. There were a lot that did though. The Russian sleep experiment, Red Mist, The Rake, and Smile Dog all had supernatural or unrealistic elements to them, but were presented with a little bit of realism. They wanted you to get absorbed into the story and feel like it could happen, even though there were elements that were impossible. The Smiling Man was presented in a very realistic way. It was presented on a subreddit with real stranger encounters. It told the story of someone meeting a possibly intoxicated, drugged, or unwell person. The story felt like it could happen to anyone, like it could happen to you. The story would become quite popular following these posts and would eventually get its own subreddit. The Smiling Man subreddit was created on November 18, 2012, 7 months after the story started circulating the internet. The bio for this community read, "A subreddit where you can submit your encounters with the dancing Smiling Man." This subreddit tracks all encounters and sightings of the Smiling Man. Users would share their stories with others in hopes of cataloging what this entity might be. One of the top posts is the Smiling Man log posted by the user HeckToTheYear65, who is also a moderator. It reads, "TSM, the Smiling Man, appears mostly in small towns in Iowa, seen mostly at night on empty streets or in cornfields. Like all stories, he has a small top hat, 6.8 tall, dancing in a waltz-like motion while looking up at the sky, and an ear-to-ear smile." The purpose of this subreddit is for people to post their encounters with TSM and probably debunk him. Don't confuse him with the Grinning Man. They are close relatives, but very different. TSM dances and stalks his victims. The Grinning Man grins and stalks and doesn't really say anything. Feel free to post links to other people's encounters from another subreddit in the comments. This is one of the top posts on the subreddit and makes a few interesting claims. One is that the Smiling Man is mostly seen in small towns and particularly prevalent in Iowa. The Smiling Man is often described as being over 6 feet tall and wearing a suit. Lastly, the walk is always this kind of strange waltz with inhuman tiptoe steps afterwards. As I was researching, everyone in this subreddit was mentioning that Iowa was the largest area with sightings. The subreddit even had a map of sightings across the US and several other parts of the world. This map has sightings in Wyoming, Florida, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and of course, Iowa. Various accounts from this subreddit and other parts of the internet all painted a very similar picture of the Smiling Man. A tall man in a suit that was always smiling with his head tilted towards the sky. Every encounter describes a smile in a similar way. It was from ear to ear and it was unnatural. The Smiling Man appeared in most places but liked the suburbs and was only really sighted late into the night. Some claimed that the Smiling Man had chased them, like in Blue Title's story, while others stated that he would just stare and dance. A few stories even claim that the Smiling Man spoke to them, usually in a threatening manner, after they'd escaped. One thing that all these stories have in common, though, is that the Smiling Man gives chase, but never catches or actually hurts anyone. So it begs the question, what does the Smiling Man actually want? Without an answer to that, we return to the Smiling Man subreddit, which also has a post from Blue Title. He was holding a Q&A about his experience. This is where we can dig a little deeper into the encounter. A user asks which major city their sighting took place in. Blue Title answers that it took place in Seattle, Washington around 2 a.m. Another question was if he believed other people's sightings of the Smiling Man. Blue Title responded with, "I'm not someone who believes in the supernatural, so I've always believed the Smiling Man was an insane person." Obviously, one insane man can't be everywhere. My description of the Smiling Man was vague enough that I think some people filled in the blanks on their own, which could have led them to believing they encountered him. I'm not going to rush out and call anything fake, but I'm sure there's a fair amount of dramatization going on in some cases. Or I could be entirely wrong, and he could be out there right now, somewhere, still looking for the right dance partner. Blue Title then gives a description of the man. Caucasian, middle-aged, dark hair, either brown or black, quite tall. If I had to guess, and I guess I do, I would say 6'2" to 6'5". His suit was dark, either black or charcoal gray. It was old in terms of style. It wasn't ratty or ripped up. No facial hair from what I could see, i.e. stubble at best. He had relatively narrow facial features. Definitely wasn't a handsome man. But he wasn't hideous either. Creepy would be the best way to describe his looks, though. He had an intensity in his eyes, and he never once made eye contact with me, though he was clearly watching me very closely with his peripheral vision. That was the most memorable thing about his looks aside from, of course, the massive smile on his face. The description of the man is something I'll come back to later. For now, there was another really interesting part of this Q&A. Blue Title mentions seeing the Smiling Man in his dreams, and even dancing along with him. He posts, "I had a dream, probably a month or so after the incident, where I was dancing with him, with the same creepy smile stretched across my face." This post is interesting because it pointed to a theory that had emerged on the No Sleep subreddit. A theory that if the Smiling Man had made physical contact with you, you would become just like him. You would be driven mad and wander the streets at night, trying to turn another person. It was the Smiling Man sickness theory. The dreams seemed to be a correlation of this theory. The story of the Smiling Man would be posted to No Sleep on April 23rd of 2012, before the official subreddit had been created. The story was well received there, and as is tradition in No Sleep, everyone had to act like the story was true. Of course, the way it was presented was as if it was true, and even now the original poster hasn't stated otherwise. Eventually, this story would leave Reddit and become a popular creepypasta. It was posted to the Creepypasta wiki on December 26th of 2012, where it received a decent amount of views. It was soon being narrated on YouTube, with one of the first channels covering it being Mr. Creepypasta. It would soon also receive a short film called 2 AM The Smiling Man, created by Michael Evans. The short film is an almost exact retelling of the original story. It currently sits at over 14 million views and is one of the most viewed creepypasta short films. The real appeal of the story is the real situation that it puts us in as the reader or listener. We haven't all had run-ins with weird people in the middle of the night, but we easily feel like we could. We could easily put ourselves in Blue Title's shoes. And we would most likely have the same result. The most intriguing part of this story, though, is that it leaves us with a lot of questions. Who or what was the Smiling Man? He wasn't normal, that much was clear, but what was his goal and why? This encounter left readers with too many questions. Questions that might be answered by digging deeper into who this man could be. You see, this wasn't the first sighting of the Smiling Man. Far from it, actually. The Smiling Man has been around longer than the majority of those who watch this channel, and far predates the internet as a whole. The year is 1966. The date, the 11th of October. In Elizabeth, New Jersey, around 9:45 p.m., two boys, Martin and James, were making their way home. The sun had already gone down, and both were feeling uneasy. They were bathed in light intermittently under the street lights, but otherwise walked through the darkness. They were apprehensive as they heard a story of a woman being chased by a man in a suit earlier that evening. As the boys made their way past a particularly large decline on the other side of a fence, they saw something. Jimmy saw it first. An incredibly tall man was standing in a bush on the opposite side of the fence. The side of the fence had a very steep decline that seemed crazy for anyone to stand on. The tall man wore a green suit that seemed to shine in the light of the street lamp. He wasn't looking in their direction, and instead appeared to be looking at a house across the street. After both boys turned to look at the man, he slowly pivoted and stared at them. A painfully wide smile broke out across his face, easily going from ear to ear. The boys wasted no time in running away, not wanting to see or hear what this man had to say. This is the first documented sighting of the entity known as the Grinning Man. Following this encounter, the boys would be questioned by John Keel, a paranormal investigator and author of the Mothman Prophecies. Keel would later recount their encounter in his book, The Complete Guide to Mysterious Beings. In this book, he also talks about many other encounters with the Grinning Man. Keel didn't question the boys alone, but also brought along UFO investigator James Mosley and Chuck McCann, an actor. The boys told their story and even in separate rooms gave the same description of the man. The man was over 6 feet tall, they agreed, and was dressed in a sparkling green coverall costume that shimmered and seemed to reflect the streetlights. There was a wide black belt around his waist. He had a very dark complexion and little round eyes, real beady, set far apart. They could not remember seeing any hair, ears, or nose on this figure. The Grinning Man's first description is very similar to the one given in the Reddit post, the main differences being the lack of ears, hair, and nose, but the kids ran so quickly they might not have seen them. He wore a shiny green suit, which also doesn't quite match up. The smile was really the main aspect of the man to stick out to so many. The smile and the fact that he was found at night and in the middle of a suburb. The area in which this sighting took place was also relevant as there had been a UFO sighting just north of the town. The UFO was sighted by 2 different police officers. A brilliant white light was seen flying across the night sky, blinding most for a period of time after looking directly at it. This incident, along with the Grinning Man sighting, would inevitably have the two combined into an alien encounter. This wasn't the only major sighting that brought the Smiling Man into the public's eye. There was another sighting in 1966, but this time it was in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The sighting took place in the same time frame as another infamous cryptid sighting, the Mothman. The Mothman surely overshadowed the appearances by the Grinning Man, as this entity was called, but researchers into the incident will know that both had a large impact on the community. The sighting took place on November 2nd of 1966. A salesman by the name of Woodrow Derenberger was driving on Interstate 77 when he saw a bizarre vehicle fly in front of him and land on the road, causing him to slow to a stop. The vehicle was described as an old-fashioned kerosene lamp chimney, flaring at both ends, narrowing down to a small neck, and then enlarging into a great bulge in the center. A door on the vehicle opened upward and out stepped a man in a blue suit that appeared to glisten. He had his dark hair slicked back and he wore a painfully wide smile. This is the first sighting of the Grinning Man, or Indrid Cold. The sighting of Cold was reported by many people that night, not just Derenberger. They all reported the exact same man speaking to them through telepathy and saying his name was Indrid Cold, and that he would be visiting them again soon. This sparked interest in possible UFO activity in the area. Thousands of UFO believers and enthusiasts swarmed the town and even more staked out Derenberger's house. This led to police needing to patrol his premises to stop onlookers from loitering. When this wasn't enough, Derenberger would leave the state, change his phone number, and remarry a girl who also had contact with the UFO. Derenberger would also go on to publish a book where he talked about his encounter with Indrid Cold and other grinning men. The book also talks about his encounters with the infamous Men in Black, who told him not to spread his story. The Men in Black are supposedly a secret agency that always appears during strange or UFO events. Another book will be written by his daughter, who tells a very similar story, and corroborates a lot of what her father said. The story is told from her point of view over the years and is a rather short read, only being 70 pages. Together, the stories paint a picture of what might have actually happened that night. These weren't the only major incidents involving the Smiling or Grinning Man. There was a sighting that wasn't considered to be a UFO encounter and is considered more of a poltergeist activity. The Lilly family, who lived south of where the first UFO sighting by the police took place, were experiencing their own trove of weird happenings. The Lilly family talked of strange lights of different colors that would be seen above their home throughout the night. They would also hear voices and what sounded like a baby crying. They would come home to their drawers and cabinets all being open. The first time they noticed anything weird was when a light appeared over their house and their TV started to cut out. Another strange instance was with the daughter-in-law of the family. She also lived in the town, but a little further south. She talked about the strange phone calls she would receive on or after 5 p.m. every night. The caller would just breathe into the phone or make a deep guttural sound before hanging up. These calls lasted for months before stopping forever. The phone lines were checked, the calls couldn't be traced. It was the strangest thing that ever happened to her. The strangest part was the phone calls would only happen as soon as she was home, like the caller always knew when she would be home. The Lily's family daughter, though, would have the most vivid sighting. She said she woke up to flashing lights outside her window, and when she looked into the darkness of her room, she saw him. A tall man in a suit, smiling down at her. He was at the foot of her bed. Then she rubbed her eyes, and he was standing over her by the side of her bed. She screamed and hid under the covers. When she looked again, he was gone. This was just one of the many strange happenings at their home that year. This was one of the many incidents where a tall man in a checkered suit was seen at the foot of people's beds. The sightings of the Smiling Man would become sporadic following the late 1960s, with a few notable ones taking place in the 80s. A woman was recounting an incident with a phantom car that she had. She claimed that a car drove up next to her, and inside was a grotesque-looking man with glowing eyes and a smile that stretched from ear to ear. The man sped off and his car disappeared into the night. In 2009, there was an encounter near Roswell, New Mexico, by a blogger named H.R. Zapruder. They write, "Soon afterwards, I drove past a man standing in the brush. I thought he was hitchhiking, so I sped past. You know hitchhikers equal bad news. Anyway, I didn't think much of it at first, but as I sped by, I noticed a green glistening, so I inspected the rear view mirror and saw the man from behind. He was bald and over 6 feet tall, wearing a sparkling green jacket. The rest was obscured by the brush. When I arrived in town, I was told by some locals I just missed a UFO." This would be the last sighting of the Smiling Man, aside from the original story that started this video. Even with the amount of sightings and theories, we're still no closer to figuring out who or what the Smiling Man actually is, or what his purpose might be. Is he an alien, or is he something more? Could the Grinning Man that was connected with extraterrestrials and the Men in Black be the same one that Blue Title saw that night? There are some similarities. Firstly, every encounter had the man as over 6 feet tall, without quite saying how much over. The Smiling Man is described as wearing a suit and has a different variation of the suit in almost every story. It was almost always a suit except for one time that it was a checkered shirt. The biggest similarity amongst the sightings was the absurdly wide smile and weird gaze. He also always appeared at night, in every sighting. His intent was always unknown. Throughout the years, individuals would report strange sightings in the middle of the night. Anything can happen when you're out in the world. A man who dances and smiles too wide may approach you. What he wants is unknown, but anyone that chases another probably doesn't have the best intentions. The Smiling Man, the Grinning Man, Indrid Cold, or whatever you want to go by. In spirit of the original post, I hope that we may never meet. This is Sacrow, and everyone have a good night.